Three dates open this story like a bill you can't return: 1713, 1717, 1718. In 1713, the War of the Spanish Succession ends and the pay stops, not the speeches, the wages. Peace is supposed to be a clean ending, but for sailors, it's a layoff notice, with salt still in the stitches. Thousands of men trained to board ships, fire cannon, and survive weeks on spoiled water are dumped back onto docks and told to become honest, as if violence were a uniform you can fold and store. The Atlantic doesn't demobilize with dignity, it coughs people out. And the ports do what ports always do when they're crowded and poor: they turn men into numbers. Hands needed, hands surplus, hands expendable. The empire calls it order. The sailor calls it hunger. And hunger is a recruiter. It doesn't ask if you're loyal to a flag. It asks whether you can live another month on wages that arrive late, shrink in the counting, or never come at all. You were promised prize money in war. Now you're offered pennies in peace. You were celebrated when you stole from the enemy. Now you're whipped for stealing from a merchant. The skill set hasn't changed. Only the paperwork has. That is the first betrayal. The state teaches you how to do violence, then criminalizes you for still being good at it. So the Caribbean becomes the obvious answer, not because it's exotic, but because it's practical. Islands scatter like hiding places, shipping lanes cut tight through narrow water. Colonial borders are loud on maps and quiet at sea, and the economy is a constant convoy of temptation: sugar, rum, tobacco, bullion, enslaved people, all moving under flags that mean money inside. In that world, piracy isn't a romantic rebellion, it's a wage negotiation conducted with cannon. But here's the twist: piracy doesn't thrive in pure chaos. It thrives in half-law, where authority exists enough to be bribed, threatened, or ignored. A ruined port like Nassau becomes a magnet, not because pirates worship freedom, but because it lets them operate like a business. Crews can sell stolen goods, ships can be repaired, rumors can be traded like currency. And the men who run this economy don't need a parliament. They need agreement, discipline, and fear. That fear becomes the real product. A pirate doesn't have to sink every ship. He just has to make captains believe he might. Once that belief spreads, merchants pay more for protection, insurers raise rates, governors panic, and London begins to notice the one language it always respects: loss. Now the empire prepares its most elegant weapon: not a fleet, a deadline. In 1717, the Crown offers mercy with conditions: surrender and be pardoned, but only within a window of time. It sounds humane until you see the structure. The offer is a funnel. Step into it, and the state learns your name, your roots, your contacts, your habits. Miss it, and you become an example. The choice is designed to make hunting cheaper. Mercy becomes administration. And administration, in the hands of an empire, is just violence with a cleaner signature. Hold the big question close, because it's about to stop being theory. Who actually pays for order when law returns to the Caribbean? Merchants, colonies, or the nameless sailors who become the receipt? The pardon is not peace, it's an audit. When the Crown announces mercy, it doesn't do it like a priest. It does it like an accountant. Names, dates, ports, deadlines, a promise that sounds soft, come in and be forgiven, but is built like a trap door. Because the problem Britain is trying to solve isn't morality, it's cost. Piracy is expensive to fight at sea. Cannon and crews and months of patrol for one ship that can vanish behind an island. So the state does what states do best. It turns violence into paperwork and makes the target walk into the file cabinet. The deadline is the first tooth. A pardon that expires teaches pirates something simple. Time is now a weapon. The state isn't begging, it's herding. If you accept, you must present yourself to authority. Sign your name into a system that can remember you forever. If you refuse, you become a legal category, not a man. You become outlaw, and once you are outlaw, anything done to you is framed as restoration, not cruelty. That's the second tooth. Language. Governors receive instructions, and they learn the new script. Pirates are no longer privateers gone rogue, no longer a blurry continuation of wartime practice. They are a disease in the trade arteries. They are common enemies of mankind. That phrase is not decoration, it's permission. When the state says an enemy is outside humanity, it gives itself room to do anything without feeling it has committed a sin. Order always begins by changing the vocabulary of harm. And this is where the Caribbean stops being a frontier and becomes a laboratory. In places like Nassau, the pardon lands like a thunderclap. Some men take it immediately, not because they suddenly grow consciences, but because they understand incentives. A pirate who turns himself in can become a legal sailor again. He can walk into a port without being shot. He can buy food openly. He can sleep without a pistol under his cheek. For men who have been living as hunted animals, law feels like warmth. But law is also a leash. The governors who offer mercy are not neutral. They are under pressure from merchants, from London, from rival colonies who accuse them of weakness. Their careers depend on results. So the pardon is used like a blade that cuts in two directions. It separates crews. It creates suspicion. A captain who wants to keep pirating now has to ask, how many of my men would rather be alive and forgiven? How many will sell me out the moment a governor offers them safety? Piracy relies on loyalty, and the state has found a way to make loyalty expensive. Some pirates accept the pardon and try to go straight. The myth says it's possible. The reality is uglier. The same economy that starved sailors in 1713 has not magically become generous in 1717. Wages are still bad. Work is still scarce. Captains still cheat. Merchants still squeeze. A pardoned pirate is not welcomed back into society. He is tolerated, watched, and often despised. He is a former criminal asked to compete in an economy that already failed him, now with fewer friends, fewer weapons, and a target painted on his back. Because here's the third tooth. The pardon doesn't erase enemies. It creates new ones. Pirates who refuse surrender now see the pardoned men as traitors. The pardoned men see the holdouts as a threat to their fragile safety. Informers become valuable. Governors cultivate them. Merchants pay for them. The Caribbean fills with whispers. Who is pretending to surrender? Who is planning to return to sea? Who is meeting old crewmates at night? The state doesn't need to patrol every channel if it can turn the pirate community into a surveillance network that polices itself. And while the pardon divides men, it also gives Britain something more precious than fear: legitimacy. A governor can now say, "We offered mercy, they refused." Whatever happens next is their choice. That is the moral alchemy. It turns punishment into justice, and justice into a public performance. Hanging a pirate isn't just killing a thief. It's proving that the state tried kindness first. It's telling merchants, insurers, and taxpayers that force is being used responsibly, even when the rope is still a rope. This is why 1718 matters, because the deadline approaches, and mercy hardens into hunting. Britain begins to apply pressure with ships and soldiers, but the real clamp is administrative. Ports become checkpoints. Papers become weapons. Captains are interrogated. Tavern owners are watched. Buyers of stolen goods, those quiet middlemen who make piracy profitable, are threatened. The state is not just chasing pirates, it is trying to starve the market that feeds them. Pirates can steal a ship, but they can't eat a ship. They need networks. They need fences. They need safe harbours. Britain aims at those arteries because cutting supply chains is cheaper than naval battles. And the pirates respond like cornered men. They escalate. The violence at sea sharpens because a pirate who believes surrender will end in betrayal has no reason to be gentle. If the state frames you as beyond humanity, you begin to act like it. If you think you'll hang either way, you stop bargaining. You stop taking prisoners. You start sending messages. So the Caribbean enters its most dangerous phase, the moment when law returns, but only in the form of threat. The moment when everyone, pirate, sailor, merchant, governor, realizes the same truth. Order is not a calm thing. Order is a campaign, and campaigns need bodies. Which brings us back to the big question, now sharper and harder to ignore. When an empire restores order, is it protecting trade? Or is it simply relocating suffering onto the men easiest to sacrifice? Because the deadline is almost here, and once mercy expires, Britain doesn't just want piracy to stop. It wants a spectacle that makes stopping feel inevitable. When the pardon expires, the Caribbean learns the difference between mercy and management. Britain doesn't just hunt pirates, it stages them. By 1718, the Empire has solved the hardest part of the war against piracy. It has made the pirates legally simple. After the deadline, you are no longer a complicated man shaped by demobilization, wages, hunger, or betrayal. You are a category, a label, a problem the law can process quickly. And once the enemy becomes a category, the state can act fast without thinking too hard about what it's doing to human bodies. This is where the sea stops being the battlefield and the courthouse becomes the weapon. The trials aren't built to explore the truth. They're built to end a debate. Evidence is gathered with a purpose. Testimony is shaped by fear and reward. Some witnesses speak because they believe in order. Most speak because they want to live. The Empire understands something. Pirates also understood. Loyalty is a currency. If you want to dismantle a crew, you don't have to kill them all. You just have to buy enough of them. So men walk into court and accuse each other with trembling mouths. Some say, "I was forced." Some say, "I was only the cook." Some swear they never held a pistol. The law nods along, not because it's compassionate, but because it's pragmatic. It needs a clean line between the salvageable and the disposable. It needs a way to turn a chaotic criminal ecosystem into a story with a moral ending. And then it needs a public conclusion. A hanging is not a private execution. It is an announcement. A rope is not simply a tool, it is a sentence written in muscle and gravity. When pirates are hanged, it's done where eyes can reach. It's done with ritual. It's done with time to gather a crowd. The state's message is not subtle. This is what happens when you don't accept our terms. But the empire's real genius is what happens after the hanging. Death is not enough. The body must keep working. In an age where many people cannot read proclamations, the corpse becomes the poster. Bodies are displayed, sometimes left to rot in places sailors will see as they enter and leave port. The wind and salt do what the empire wants. They turn a man into a warning. The state doesn't even have to speak. It lets the body talk, day after day, tide after tide, until fear becomes part of the coastline. This is what order looks like when it is made real. Not a charter, not a sermon, but a human being kept on display to prove that the law is stronger than the sea. And now the big question stops being theoretical, because the numbers start to add up in flesh. Who paid for order? Merchants benefit first. Insurance becomes thinkable again. Shipping schedules become less of a gamble. Ports breathe. Colonial governors can write calmer letters. London can pretend it has tamed the Atlantic. The empire can collect customs with fewer interruptions and fewer embarrassing headlines about ships taken within sight of shore. But the bill is not paid by the men in counting houses. It is paid by sailors who were trained for war and then thrown away when peace made them inconvenient. It is paid by dock workers and petty traders who are squeezed by prices and taxes while being told this crackdown is for their safety. It is paid by coerced witnesses who trade truth for survival. And yes, it is paid by pirates themselves, especially the lowest men on the deck, the ones who followed because they were hungry, not because they were dreaming of crowns and flags. The empire does not have to solve poverty to win. It only has to make poverty less explosive. That's the ugly brilliance of the strategy. Britain does not eliminate the conditions that created piracy. It rearranges them. It offers a controlled exit to some men and a controlled death to others, then calls the result justice. The pardon becomes a filter. The trials become a conveyor belt. The gibbets become theatre, and the public is trained slowly to accept a simple logic. Suffering is acceptable if it produces stability. Now look at the pirates, stripped of romance. Look at what piracy actually was at its most common level. A violent labor revolt without a manifesto. A brutal attempt to force better terms in a world that offered none. Pirates broke rules, yes. They robbed and killed. But they also exposed what the empire refused to admit. The Atlantic economy was already violent. Piracy didn't invent cruelty. It competed with it. It did to trade what trade was quietly doing to men, extracting value with minimal concern for the bodies involved. That is why the state must destroy piracy publicly. Not only because piracy steals, because piracy mirrors. A pirate crew is a frightening parody of imperial order. Its own rules, its own punishments, its own shares, its own hierarchy. Made from the same human materials as the Empire, but without the Empire's permission. The Crown cannot tolerate a rival system of violence, not because the rival is more brutal, but because it proves violence is not sacred. It is transferable. It can belong to anyone with guns and agreement. So Britain reclaims monopoly. It says, "Only we may do harm and call it lawful." This is the philosophical core of the crackdown. The rope is not merely punishment for theft. It is the Empire reasserting ownership over coercion. And when you understand that, the pardon with a deadline stops looking like kindness. It looks like a policy designed to make the public complicit. The Empire gives pirates a choice it controls, then uses that choice to justify whatever it does next. It transforms fear into consent. It makes people say they had their chance, so the hanging can be watched without guilt. That is how power uses law, not only to stop violence, but to make violence feel deserved. The story closes, not with a tidy victory, but with a coastline that remembers. Piracy declines, yes. The so-called Golden Age contracts under pressure, but nothing about the system becomes gentle. Sailors still suffer. Work remains dangerous and underpaid. The Atlantic continues to eat men. The only difference is that now the Empire's violence is wearing a uniform again. Now it comes with stamps and seals. Now it is called order. So here is the answer to the big question. The one we opened like a bill you can't return. Britain restored order in the Caribbean not by ending cruelty, but by choosing whose cruelty counted as legitimate. It relocated suffering onto the men easiest to sacrifice, the nameless, the desperate, the unanchored. It made an example of them so trade could breathe. It offered mercy as a tactic, not a virtue. And when mercy ran out, it turned bodies into infrastructure, warnings nailed to the edge of the world. Because empires don't hate violence, they hate competition. And the final lesson is the hardest one. The sea did not become safer because humanity improved. It became safer because the empire learned how to convert fear into policy, policy into spectacle, and spectacle into obedience, until everyone could look at a corpse swinging in the salt wind and call it peace. Here's the part the official story never likes to keep on screen. Once piracy is defeated, the sea doesn't become moral. It becomes franchised. Because what the crackdown really accomplished was not the end of predation, it was the restoration of a monopoly. The Crown didn't drain violence out of the Atlantic. It simply relabeled it, put it behind paperwork, and charged rent for access. The ocean stayed the same. The only thing that changed was who could steal with legal grammar. That's why the hangings, the cages, the deadlines matter. They weren't the end of a crisis. They were the installation of a new operating system. You can see it in the aftermath, in the behavior of everyone who won. Merchants don't suddenly become kinder to sailors because pirates are gone. Wages don't magically rise. Discipline aboard ships doesn't soften into brotherhood. The economy still runs on scarcity, coercion, and distance. Distance from oversight, distance from consequences, distance from the people whose bodies pay the costs. So the sea fills the gap the way it always does, with alternatives. Smuggling grows where tariffs bite. Corruption blooms where officials are underpaid and far from supervision. Private violence returns whenever a war flares up, Because empires love pirates when they can invoice them. Give a captain a commission, call him a privateer, and suddenly the same act, ambush, seizure, intimidation, is patriotic. The flag changes. The mechanics don't. And this is the moral infection at the heart of the whole drama. The Empire can't fully condemn piracy without condemning the logic that built the Empire. Pirates didn't come from nowhere. They came from ships, from fleets, from the disciplined training of men whose only marketable skill was controlled brutality. They came from a world that had already taught them that force solves problems faster than prayer. The war ends, the pay stops, and the state acts surprised that its own methods return in unauthorized hands. So the crackdown is not merely a battle against criminals. It is the state cleaning up its own spill. That's why the pardon with a deadline is so coldly brilliant. It turns the pirate problem into a story of personal failure rather than systemic design. It encourages everyone watching to say, they chose this. It invites the public to stop asking why the pipeline exists at all, from sailor to deserter to pirate, and to focus instead on individual sin. And once you've convinced a population to blame individuals, you can preserve the machine. Which brings us back to the big question, the one we dragged through Acts the Wire to 3 like an anchor. Who paid for order in the Caribbean? Not the crown? Not really. A crown doesn't pay, it collects. The most visible payment was made by the pirates who swung for the lesson, but the deeper payment was made by ordinary maritime labor, because the crackdown didn't just punish outlaw violence, it also stabilized legal exploitation. When pirates are removed from the map, sailors lose one of the few forces that ever pressured owners to treat crews like human beings with leverage. Without that pressure, the ship becomes what it always wanted to be, a floating factory where obedience is cheaper than dignity. The colonies pay too, in a different way. They gain safer shipping lanes, but they also gain tighter imperial grip. When piracy is suppressed, London's reach lengthens. Customs enforcement stiffens. Governors become less negotiators and more managers. Security becomes the reason for surveillance, for patrols, for new legal teeth. The Empire doesn't just pacify criminals, it pacifies autonomy. Even the merchants pay, in a paradoxical long-term sense. Yes, their goods move more reliably, but stability comes with paperwork, regulation, and a state that increasingly believes the ocean is its bloodstream. To protect trade, the Empire builds the very institutions that later can squeeze trade. That's the bargain. You ask power for safety, and power asks for your throat in exchange. And the people who pay without ever being named? The nameless men pressed into service, the boys who sign on because they're hungry, the families who never receive bodies back, only rumors. The public never sees them. The public sees the pirate, romantic, monstrous, convenient. The pirate is the mask that lets the machine keep turning. That is the final twist of this story. Piracy was a horror, but it was also a confession. It confessed that the Atlantic economy was never clean. It confessed that violence wasn't an accident. It was a tool. Pirates simply used it without permission. So when Britain wins, it wins by teaching everyone a lesson that still echoes in modern politics. If you want a population to accept suffering, you don't need to eliminate suffering. You just need to curate it. You need to decide who suffers, in public, and why. You need a narrative that makes spectators feel like justice happened, even when what really happened was efficiency. And if you want the audience to stop questioning the system, you give them a villain whose death feels like closure. That's why the bodies were displayed. That's why the rope mattered. Not because the empire was uniquely cruel. History is full of cruelty. But because the empire learned how to make cruelty feel administrative, predictable, necessary, a cost of doing business. So the ledger closes the way it always closes, with tidy numbers on top and invisible bodies underneath. The sea becomes calmer, not because it is kinder, but because the empire finally proves it can out-organize chaos. Pirates lose because they cannot build institutions fast enough. They cannot print legitimacy. They cannot turn their violence into law. Britain can. And that's the part that should unsettle you. The end of piracy is not a moral victory. It's an accounting victory. It's the moment the state reasserts its claim to be the only acceptable pirate in the Atlantic, because it can stamp the paper, write the sentence, and hang the proof. Order returns. But it returns the way a lock returns to a door. Not to protect everyone equally, but to decide who gets in, and who stays out in the storm. After the last pirate is measured, named, and made into a warning, the Atlantic doesn't breathe out. It exhales a new story. Because power never wastes a good corpse. It archives it. It copies it. It sells it back to you as entertainment. The pirate becomes a costume precisely because the empire needed him to become one. A villain you can laugh at is a villain who stops being evidence. A villain who sings in taverns is a villain whose hunger, wages, and bruises no longer matter. The rope becomes a punchline. The cage becomes scenery. The crackdown becomes the return of order, clean enough to teach in school and harmless enough to reenact on holidays. And this is where the ledger really completes itself. The empire doesn't just defeat the pirates, it inherits their brand. Look at how quickly the narrative flips. Before the noose, pirates are described as infection, plague, rot, contagion. After the noose, they're reduced into characters: colourful rogues, convenient monsters, romantic criminals. The machine needs that shift. Because if you keep pirates as an infection, someone might ask, what conditions produced the disease? But if you reframe them as a type, a bad personality, a bad choice, then the system is absolved. The pipeline disappears. The poverty vanishes. The war demobilization fades into the background. All that remains is a moral fable: good law versus bad men. That fable is not harmless. It's a template. Every era has its pirates. People and groups treated as proof that the state must expand its reach. And the pattern repeats with almost insulting consistency. First, fear is broadcast. Then, extraordinary measures are introduced temporarily. Then the measures stay. Then the public forgets why they were introduced in the first place. And because the measures are now normal, the system can use them for purposes that have nothing to do with the original threat. The Caribbean crackdown wasn't only about stopping pirates. It was a rehearsal for how to make an empire feel like a rescue operation. And here's the uncomfortable point. It worked because it offered ordinary people something real. Safer shipping. Fewer sudden raids. Less uncertainty. This is why the moral trap is so effective. Power rarely needs to invent benefits. It only needs to attach those benefits to tools that also increase control. You accept the medicine, and the dosage includes obedience. So when we ask, one last time, who paid for order in the Caribbean, the final answer is not a single group. It's a layered invoice. Pirates paid publicly, rope, iron, spectacle. Sailors paid quietly, through stagnant wages, harsher discipline, fewer alternatives. Colonies paid politically, through tighter imperial administration dressed as security. Merchants paid strategically, by trading autonomy for protection, then discovering that protection comes with teeth. And the broader Atlantic world paid psychologically, by learning to confuse legality with morality, and to treat state violence as different, not because it is gentler, but because it is authorized. That is the real legacy, not the skull flag, not the treasure myth, not the swagger. The legacy is permission. The state proved it could redefine violence by stamping it. It proved it could turn terror into policy and policy into virtue. It proved it could kill in public and call it governance. And once a system proves that, it rarely forgets the trick. So, if you came here expecting an ending where the sea becomes safe and the story becomes clean, you get the opposite. You get a sea that is safer for commerce and crueler for labor. You get a story that is cleaner for the empire and dirtier for everyone else. You get order that feels like a solution until you realize it was also a purchase. Paid for in bodies, paid for in silence, paid for in the public's willingness to clap when the cage swings. And that's why those 3 dates still matter. They're not just timestamps in a pirate saga. They're a blueprint of how power stabilizes itself after chaos. Drain the market of unauthorized violence, rebrand what remains, and make the audience feel grateful for the lock on the door. When the ledger closes, the bodies still speak, but only if you refuse to let the empire turn them into a joke. And here's the last cruelty. The crackdown didn't end piracy, so much as it professionalized who gets to be violent. The same ocean routes kept swallowing men. The same work kept breaking bodies. The same legal discipline kept crawling down the chain of command like rust. Only now, the violence wore uniforms, carried paperwork, and called itself stability. The pirate, unlicensed, was hunted. The empire, licensed, was celebrated. The difference wasn't the blade, it was the signature. So if you want a clean moral, you don't get one. You get a question you can't unlearn. When power says it is restoring order, who is it really protecting? People, or the system that profits from people being afraid? Because fear is not just a feeling. It's a budget. It's a job posting. It's a new office. It's a ship commissioned for security. It's a governor granted emergency authority. It's a courtroom that learns to move faster when the victim is inconvenient. It's a public that learns to applaud the cage, because it's been trained to believe that cages only hold monsters. Pirates made the mistake of being honest about what they were: theft, force, and desperate economics with a flag on top. Empires almost never make that mistake. Empires call it policy. Empires call it trade. Empires call it civilization. And they rely on you to stop looking once the word law appears on the label. If this story bothered you, good. That discomfort is the point. It means the spectacle didn't fully anesthetize you. It means you can still see the trick. the state doesn't just punish crime. It defines crime in ways that protect its own violence from being named. So the next time you hear a modern promise, we'll restore order, listen for the hidden invoice. Ask what gets expanded. Ask what gets normalized. Ask whose bodies are being volunteered to make the policy feel righteous. Because the Caribbean wasn't a one-off. It was a demonstration, and that demonstration still runs, quietly, in every era that needs an enemy to justify new powers. The rope stopped swinging. The cages were taken down. The legends remained. And somewhere in the paperwork of security, the same old question is still waiting, sharp as salt in a wound. Who paid for order, and who collected? If you strip away the romance, piracy stops being a costume drama and turns into a labor story with teeth. Look at the ingredients again. Demobilized sailors trained for violence and then discarded. Wages that arrive late or not at all. Captains with near absolute authority. Merchants who treat human bodies like replaceable rigging. And courts that can turn a poor man into a lesson faster than they can turn a rich man into a criminal. In that world, choice is mostly a word used by people who never had to choose between hunger and a noose. That's why the Golden Age didn't end with a single battle. It ended when the Empire learned to price fear correctly. The pardon wasn't mercy, it was strategy. It isolated the stubborn, divided crews and gave governors a clean story to sell. We offered peace, they refused. The trials weren't just verdicts. They were theatre designed to erase motive and replace it with moral simplicity. The hangings weren't only punishment, they were a broadcast. This is what happens when you step outside our violence economy. And then the machine kept running, just with better branding. Because the system doesn't mind criminals, it minds competitors. Unlicensed violence is intolerable, not because it's violent, but because it doesn't pay the right people. It doesn't follow the right hierarchy. It doesn't reinforce the right myths. That's the real threat piracy posed. It exposed how thin the line was between a pirate crew and a legal enterprise when both were built on forced risk, unequal reward, and men treated as expendable. So here's the final turn of the knife. If you leave this story thinking, pirates were monsters, you've only finished the first half. The harder thought is this: piracy was a symptom. The disease was a world where law protected profit more reliably than it protected life, and then demanded gratitude for the protection. That's why the legend survives. It's easier to worship a rebel than to admit the conditions that manufacture rebels are still recognizable. It's easier to point to the outlaw and say, evil, than to point to the system and say, convenient. So keep the big question with you, because it doesn't belong to the Caribbean. It belongs to every society that claims to be civilized while quietly needing fear to function. When power says it is restoring order, who is it really protecting? People, or the system that profits from people being afraid? If you want the answer, don't start with the pirate flag. Start with the pay ledger. Start with who gets forgiven, who gets made an example, and who gets to call their violence necessary. And if you can still hear the ocean after the story ends, good. That means you're listening to the part history can't file away, the receipt. Here's what Empire always wants at the end: a clean story, a villain you can hang, a date you can circle, a problem you can declare solved. Piracy becomes a temporary fever, cured by firmness and faith and the king's benevolence. The Caribbean becomes a map the empire finally tamed. Order returns. Commerce breathes again. The sea is safe. But that version is a bedtime story told by people who collect taxes in daylight. Because even after the last bodies stopped swinging, the engine that produced them stayed intact. A labor market that discards men, a legal system that sanctifies property, and a propaganda machine that paints control as virtue. The pirate is convenient because he makes violence look like an exception, when in reality, violence was the baseline currency of the Atlantic world. Pirates didn't invent brutality. They just stopped pretending it was polite. And that's why the legend keeps resurrecting itself in every century. Not because piracy was good, but because the pirate myth offers a fantasy that the powerless can seize agency in a rigged system. The fantasy is seductive. A crew votes, splits loot, defies kings, lives free. It's the dream of equality in a world that sells inequality as natural. It's the dream that the sea, vast, indifferent, ungoverned, can wash away the rules written on land. But the ocean never liberated anyone by itself. People did. And people also built cages out of law and called them civilization. So, if you're wondering why the Golden Age ends so abruptly in the records, stop looking for a single hero's death. Look for a policy that learned how to convert panic into legitimacy. Look for governors who turned public fear into funding. Look for merchants who demanded protection and got a state-built monopoly on violence in return. Look for the moment the empire realized it could manufacture consent by staging morality. That's the trick. Power doesn't just punish rebels. It harvests them. It takes men pushed into desperation, waits until they become visible enough to hate, then uses their bodies to teach obedience to everyone else. It calls that education. It calls that peace. It calls that justice. And if that feels uncomfortably familiar, good. That means you didn't watch this as folklore. You watched it as anatomy. So the last time, because this is the only question worth ending on. When power says it is restoring order, who is paying for that order? And who is cashing it? If you want more stories like this, stories where the romance gets stripped off and the machinery underneath is exposed, subscribe. Because the past doesn't repeat. It recruits. And it recruits the easiest people first, the ones who accept the clean story. Next time, we'll follow another clean story and find the bloodstains it's trying to hide. You might think the story ends with silence, with the last pardon expired, the last trial finished, the last harbor cleansed. But history doesn't stop when the sea gets quiet. It just changes uniforms. Because the anti-piracy campaign wasn't merely a hunt, it was a rehearsal. A test run for how to govern a violent economy without admitting it's violent. Look at what the crackdown actually produced. It didn't create peace. It created infrastructure, faster courts, clearer categories of enemy, tighter shipping lanes, more permanent naval presence, better intelligence from informants, and a public ritual of punishment that could be scaled. Once you build that machine for pirates, you don't unbuild it. You just aim it at the next problem that threatens profit. And suddenly, you can see the deeper pattern. The pirate is not the opposite of empire. He's empire's shadow. Proof that the same Atlantic system that can organize fleets can also manufacture bandits. The same ports that feed trade can feed theft. The same sailors trained for war can become sailors trained for predation. The system creates surplus violence, then panics when that violence stops being rentable. This is the part the clean story avoids. Piracy was a symptom of an economy that ran on risk and disposability. Sailors were treated like fuel. Burn them, replace them, call it necessary. When they broke, the system didn't offer repair. It offered sermons. It offered poverty. It offered the sea again, with a knife in your belt and a law behind you that protected cargo more than lungs. So when those men formed crews, wrote their own rules, punished captains, distributed shares, don't romanticize it, but don't miss the point either. They were doing what the empire claimed to do, organizing violence with procedure. They were building a mini-state on a stolen ship, and that terrified the real state more than theft ever did, because the threat wasn't the gold. The threat was the precedent. If a group of discarded laborers can draft an order that competes with imperial order, then imperial order looks less like nature and more like design. And once people see order as design, they start asking who designed it for whom. That question is lethal to a regime that sells itself as inevitable. So the empire responded with a message that could be understood by anyone who can count. We can out-organize you. We can out-punish you. We can make mercy into a weapon and law into a trap. We can offer you a choice that isn't a choice at all. And then it did something even more effective than hanging pirates. It absorbed the aesthetics of piracy and turned them into entertainment. That's the final insult. The pirate becomes a costume, a flag on a mug, a joke, a children's story, a lovable outlaw with eyeliner and a soundtrack. The system that killed him takes his image and sells it back to the world, sterilized, profitable, harmless. Because a romantic pirate doesn't interrogate anything. A romantic pirate never forces you to look at wages, or war demobilization, or the ways legal trade depended on coercion, kidnapping, and hunger. A romantic pirate doesn't ask why desperate men preferred the noose to another voyage under another captain. A romantic pirate keeps you safely inside fantasy, where violence is exciting and consequences are off-screen. But the real pirate story, the one that makes the empire squirm, is not about treasure. It's about accounting. Who could use violence and still be called legitimate? Who could steal and still be called commerce? Who could kill and still be called law? That's why the Golden Age doesn't end as a moral lesson. It ends as a budget line, as a set of administrative upgrades, as a new agreement between merchants and the state. We will fund your force, and you will protect our property, and together we will call it civilization. And the men who couldn't fit into that agreement, those men became examples, not examples of evil the way the posters claimed. Examples of what happens when you step outside the approved channels of violence, when you stop paying your taxes to the right people, when you stop dying in the correct direction. So, if you want to understand why the Empire cared so much, don't stare at the gallows like it's the finale. Look at what the gallows allowed next. It allowed a broader claim over the sea. It allowed a stricter definition of who counts as lawful labor. It allowed the state to present itself as protector, while it expanded its reach. It allowed the Atlantic to become less chaotic for the people with cargo, and more trapped for the people, with nothing but muscle and debt. Which brings us back, one last time, to the question that never truly resolves, because it isn't a pirate question, it's a power question. When order is restored, whose order is it, and whose bodies were used to prove it works? If you felt the answer tightening around your throat, that's not discomfort, that's recognition. Because the sea was never the only place where law and violence negotiated terms. It was just the place where the negotiation was visible, loud, and wet with salt. And the Empire learned its lesson well. Not how to stop piracy, how to stop people from imagining alternatives. There's a temptation, after a story like this, to hunt for a single villain you can comfortably hate. A Blackbeard, a bonnet, a name with a face you can pin to a corkboard and call the problem solved. But that's the trick the archive plays on you. It hands you famous pirates the way a magician hands you a shiny coin, so you stop looking at the hand doing the work. Because the real engine of this era isn't a man. It's a contract, a set of incentives. A world that trained thousands to kill for the state, then fired them with empty pockets and moral lectures. A world that called that peace. Piracy didn't bloom in a vacuum. It bloomed in the gap between what empire promised, order, law, prosperity, and what it actually delivered to the people who made it run. Debt, disease, violence, and the constant message that your life is cheaper than cargo. And when those discarded men built their own floating counter-society, the Empire reacted the way power always reacts when it sees a rival system forming in its blind spot. It didn't debate them. It didn't bargain in good faith. It didn't ask why. It weaponized mercy. It accelerated law. It made punishment public. It took the Atlantic, this vast, indifferent ocean, and tried to stamp it with a single signature. So, yes, the pirate is hanged. The governor applauds. The merchant counts his savings. The newspaper prints a tidy ending. But the big question wasn't, did pirates deserve it? That's a distraction. The big question was uglier, and it survives the noose. When power restores order, is it ending violence or monopolizing it? Now look at the result with sober eyes. The sea becomes safer, but only in a very specific way. Safe for investment, safe for schedules, safe for the predictable movement of goods and profits. The human risk doesn't vanish. It's redistributed. It is pushed downward, away from the people who can complain in Parliament, and toward the people whose complaints sink without record. That is the hidden victory of the crackdown. Not moral cleansing, but administrative conquest. The state learns it can turn fear into funding, law into theatre, mercy into bait, and punishment into public proof that it deserves to grow larger. And that mechanism is portable. You can feel it echoing long after the Golden Age ends. In how states define criminals and enemies, depending on whether violence serves the approved economy, in how security becomes a reason that never expires, in how the rhetoric of protection is used to expand control over borders, labor, movement, speech. The pirate story is not a relic. It is a manual. So, if you want the honest ending, it isn't the last hanging. The honest ending is a quiet harbor where ships move on time, and no one asks what it cost to make them move on time. No one asks whose backs took the strain. No one asks whose options were reduced to starvation service, or the rope. That silence is the product. And it's why the pirate still haunts us, not as a cartoon, not as a costume, but as an accusation. A reminder that law and violence are not opposites. They are often partners. The difference is paperwork and permission. The Empire didn't defeat piracy by becoming less brutal. It defeated piracy by making brutality look legitimate. It made punishment into policy, and policy into morality, and morality into a story you can repeat to yourself without choking. So the ledger closes, yes. The episode ends. The ocean calms. But the question stays on the table like a knife you can't pretend not to see. Whose order is this? And who paid for it? If you're still here, you already know why that question matters. Subscribe if you want more histories where the myth gets interrogated and the receipts get read out loud. Because the bodies don't stop speaking when the credits roll. We just get better at not listening. If this ending feels too clean, that's because it's designed to. History doesn't just record violence, it edits it. It trims the messy motives into a moral tale that flatters whoever won. That's why the pirate story is always told with costumes and catchphrases, never with invoices, never with rations, never with the quiet arithmetic of men who came home from war and discovered peace meant unemployment, debt, and a rope waiting at the end of the road. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The Empire didn't solve piracy the way a doctor cures a disease. It solved piracy the way a landlord solves a dispute, by deciding who has the right to force and who doesn't. The moment the state regains control of the sea lanes, it also regains control of what counts as legitimate violence. Not less violence, just violence with a stamp. That's why the spectacle mattered. The executions weren't primarily about removing bodies. They were about manufacturing certainty. They were about teaching everyone watching, sailor, dockhand, tavern owner, runaway, what the world had become. That the ocean had a border now. That fear had a uniform now. That mercy had terms and conditions now. And you can almost hear the logic clicking into place, like a lock. If your hunger is illegal, then your survival is a crime. If your mutiny is illegal, then your wages can stay unpaid. If your refusal is illegal, then your labor becomes discipline. If your community is illegal, then your only legal community is the one that profits from you. Piracy frightened the Empire not because pirates were uniquely cruel. Cruelty was standard operating procedure in Atlantic business, but because pirates threatened the narrative. They exposed that law was never a neutral halo floating above the sea. Law was an instrument. It protected property first, and human beings only when convenient. Pirates made that visible, and visibility is dangerous. So the crackdown had to do more than kill pirates. It had to kill the idea that alternatives could exist. It had to teach the colonies to think like the metropole, to equate security with obedience, to equate order with trade, to equate peace with the uninterrupted movement of wealth. And when you zoom out far enough, that's why the pirate story keeps coming back in modern culture. Not because we miss the cutlasses, because we recognize the pattern. We recognize the bargain that still gets offered in different uniforms, different courts, different headlines. Surrender your unpredictability, and we will call you safe. Accept our rules, and we will call you civilized. Let us decide what violence is necessary, and we will call you protected. But protection always has a price. and the invoice is rarely sent to the people who requested it. So, if you want to carry one thing out of this story, don't carry a name, carry a question. Carry the one the Empire never wanted you to ask in the first place. When order returns, who gets to breathe easier? And who gets pushed into the dark so the numbers look good? Because that is the real legacy of the Golden Age's end. Not that pirates disappeared, but that power learned how to make its violence feel like virtue. And once a state learns that trick, it never forgets. Next time, we'll follow what happens when the state doesn't just police the sea, but turns the ship itself into a machine of profit, where freedom is advertised on paper and bondage is enforced below deck. But the sea doesn't stay quiet just because the hangings worked. It never did, because the Empire's solution only solved one problem. It reclaimed the brand name of violence. It didn't erase the conditions that made piracy feel rational. It didn't fix the wages that evaporated after war. It didn't stop captains from treating crews like disposable rope. It didn't soften the law that protected cargo more fiercely than bodies. It just redrew the boundaries of who was allowed to take and who would be called a monster for trying. And that's why the story has a second life, right after the first one ends. Watch what happens when the state wins the sea lanes. The shipping increases. The paperwork multiplies. The ports become louder, richer, more orderly. And underneath that order, inside the holds, in the accounting, in the silent compartments of the Atlantic economy, something else expands with it. Something that makes piracy look like a crude, desperate rebellion compared to the elegance of legalized extraction. Because once a government proves it can pacify the ocean, it can industrialize it. A pirate ship is theft with risk. A merchant empire is theft with insurance. A pirate captain points a pistol and takes your goods once. An empire writes a contract and takes your labor for life, then teaches you to call it commerce. The pirates were a crisis because they made the brutality obvious. Knife in hand, blood on deck, a choice made in front of witnesses. But the next system is worse in a colder way. It removes the witnesses. It makes the suffering procedural. It makes cruelty scalable. And here's the darkest joke. When the crackdown ends, the Empire doesn't throw away the tools it used to end piracy. It keeps them. It refines them. It reuses the same language, security, trade, stability, to justify whatever comes next. The gallows become a policy tool. The pardon becomes leverage. The amnesty becomes a trap with a deadline. The Navy becomes not just a defense force, but a moving border, a floating courthouse, a gun barrel pointed at anyone who interrupts the flow of money. That's the real end of the Golden Age. Not the disappearance of pirates, but the perfection of control. So when people romanticize pirates as freedom fighters, or dismiss them as pure villains, they're both doing the same thing. They're avoiding the uncomfortable middle. They're pretending the real subject is personality, not structure. Bad men did bad things, or rebels resisted oppression. Easy, comfortable, and completely safe for the people who benefit from the system that replaced them. But if you listen to the story the way power fears you might, a different picture shows itself. Piracy was a symptom. The crackdown was a performance. And the Empire's victory was not peace. It was consolidation. Which means the big question doesn't stay in the 1710s. It follows you. It follows every society that claims to be restoring order, while quietly rewriting who counts as human. So we end where we began, with the question that the hangings were meant to silence. When power offers law as mercy, is it ending violence, or just monopolizing it? If you want the next chapter, we're not staying on the deck. Next time, we're going below it, into the holds where bodies became cargo, where contracts became cages, where the Empire learned to make atrocity look like logistics. And once you see that machinery up close, you'll understand why pirates weren't the greatest threat to the Atlantic Order. They were just the loudest mirror it couldn't smash fast enough. If you value the historical record, subscribe, because the ledger never stops. It just changes handwriting.